Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. This is Spy Story Night. I mean, what could be more fun? We thought for a moment that David McCloskey would be joining us from an undisclosed location in Syria, but he got his camera to work. So I'm happy to say that he will be discussing Damascus station with us live. And let me say that David is coming to Phoenix late in February and will drop by and sign our copies. But meanwhile, we discovered that his publisher is actually sold out. So we snagged the last dozen or so, and I would advise you to order quickly in case we can snag some more. But that's really good news for you, David. For a first novel to actually sell out its whole print run is remarkable. So good job.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Thank you.
Paul Vidich, a wonderful author whose book, he tells me, has just been listed by the Washington Post as one of the top 10 books for February, which is so cool, has written a book called The Matchmaker, which I really, really like. And I will tell you a little bit about one of the features of it that I found particularly interesting. But let me read you just a little quote from the Wall Street Journal about Paul, because I mean, if I were Paul, I would just die after I heard somebody wrote this about my book. Shades of Graham Greene, Eric Ambler, and John le Carre hover over the pages of Paul Vidich's Cold War thriller set in West and East Berlin in the eventful years of 1989 and 90. While some of the book's elements are familiar, the tense stakeout at the crossing bridge, the moral double talk, the innovative Mr. Vidich subverts expectations in ways that surprise. I mean, that's really a fabulous statement, Paul.
I was pleased. Tom Nolan is a wonderful critic, and whenever you have something like that said about your book, you sort of have to be pleased.
Well, sure. Yes, you're walking in the footsteps of giants, that's for sure, which I think is wonderful. I will say that my own take on this is that Anne, who is, which Paul will tell you about, is an interesting character because I find her hard to like some of the time. And I find that some of her motivations are complicated. And I really enjoyed reading a book in which, you didn't have like a superhero or somebody that was one-dimensional. And I think in a spy story, particularly because le Carre was good at that, people were shades of gray. They were not all good, all bad, whatever. So that's my take on Anne, and one reason I like The Mercenary. David has some very complicated characters in his book too. And Syria is a theater that I can't recall reading a spy novel about. So I'm going to turn this over to these two guys, and I will, as I always do, interrupt whenever I feel like it. So who wants to be the lead? David, do you want to start out? Tell us a bit about your book and harangue Paul or whatever you want to do.
Well, let me start by maybe haranguing Paul first. I mean, first off, Paul, I think, congrats on pub day for The Matchmaker here. I was lucky enough to get an advance copy of this and obviously to read through it. And I found it to be, as Barbara said, just a wonderful, I think, both dive into place, Berlin 1989, the sort of, evocative setting that I think so many of us kind of understand theoretically from the history books, but we haven't, smelled it, we haven't tasted it, we haven't kind of lived it through the eyes of the character. And then this wonderful, again, as Barbara mentioned, examination of largely, Anne, your sort of complex protagonist who finds herself in a situation that she never expected she would be in, and she sort of has to navigate this world of, what's true, who am I, and what am I going to do with a circumstance that I've been dropped in that is far less than ideal, and how do I navigate the complexities and the gray areas to kind of get out of that. I thought it was a wonderful treatment of sort of betrayal and loyalty and so many of these themes that spy fiction trods, so much, but you do it in a very original and creative way. So, kudos to you on that. And I thought, if I could kick it off, I'd love to just kind of maybe have you tell us a little bit about the book and where the idea for it came from.
Well, thank you for those comments. I will get to your book, and I had similar thoughts about your book. So the book is set in Berlin, and after you will find out as soon as you finish your first book, you start thinking about what's your second book going to be, and I usually start with place. I think of a city or a place that intrigues me, or I realize it's possible to create a mood in a location that will convey what I want to convey in the characters. And so I sort of start with place. And in this case, I started with Berlin, which is the city more so than probably any other city that has drawn spies to it. From the beginning of, Kristallnacht until the fall of the wall, which is about 50 years, 39, 38 to 89, you had Berlin as the front line for spying. You had the Soviets, the East Germans, the West Germans, the British, MI6, and you had the Americans. And many authors have chosen to set their books in Berlin. Joe Cannon, Lynn Dighton, it's a whole list of them. And so in some ways you go to Berlin because if you're writing a spy novel, that's where the spies are. And you say that's where you're. So the question becomes, which Berlin? Is it Berlin of 1939? Is it Berlin of 1983 when the wall went up? Is it, the Berlin of 1989 when the wall went down? I chose that Berlin because I was very interested in East Germany, the Stasi, and surveillance society, and particularly the end of surveillance society. And we sort of live in this weird time now where we sort of feel surveilled, whether it's because people are checking your clicks in the office or whether you are being, followed on Instagram or Facebook. There's a sense of loss of privacy. And East Germany, more than any other country, was the premier example of an authoritarian regime. And so I thought, what would be an interesting story to place there? And as a consequence of doing some research, particularly reading the autobiography of Marcus Wolf, who was the head of Stasi counterintelligence, I sort of chose a place, a time, and I chose a character. And that character happened to be Anne Simpson. And I did want to make her a complicated character. She's not a spy herself, but she finds herself in a relationship with a spy and somebody who she has married. And I will go in briefly, unless you want to interrupt. The thing that I found about Marcus Wolf's book most interesting is that he was a spy that all of his adversaries in MI6 and the CIA admired, because he was sort of supremely intelligent, clever, and used spycraft in ways that other people didn't. And among the things that he did was he created something called the Romeo Network, in which he sent East German young men, handsome, into West Berlin and West Germany to cultivate relationships with West Berlin women or American women. And then unknowingly, those women, because they were vulnerable, they might have been lonely or needed money, fell in love. And through that love, they may have ended up in a marriage. And then when the wall came down, many of these women discovered that they had been living a lie. And that's, I thought, wow, how do you wake up in a marriage and figure out that the person you thought you were married to isn't the person you were married to? Marriages are complicated. I've been married 45 years. And when I first met my wife, she was in an editorial position with me. And I thought she was dull because I didn't want to be in that position. And then I discovered that she had a other life. She was a cabaret singer at night. And I that became very interesting. And this is true of all marriages. You often don't know everything about the person In fact, you always never know everything about the person you're marrying. And then over the course of, your marriage, you discover things. What happens when what you discover is that your spouse is a spy? That's a pretty dramatic event. And I chose to explore that in her character. And that may be one reason why she's not as easily likable, because she's dealing with a lot of trauma in her own life, and has to overcome some of the things that people are telling her. And that sort of becomes the story. It's a spy story, but it's also a personal story about reconciliation, justice, and betrayal.
And survival.
And
Because
survival.
I think that her driving motivation, in part, when I say driving motivation for her is her own survival. And some of her choices reflect, how determined she is that she is going to survive this situation that she has gotten into. I don't know if either of you have watched MHC TV, which is a foreign television network, which we absolutely love, and it features serial television made in all different countries. I mean, Call My Agent was one of them, etc. There's a very good one called The Fox, in which an East German woman, a Stasi agent, ends up in West Berlin after the wall comes down, and some of her associates too, and how she's trying to live with and live down her career as a Stasi in a world where they don't have any function anymore. I found it fascinating. I thought of it when I read your book.
Actually, I don't know that show, but I just wrote it down. It sounds like a wonderful premise.
You'd like it, I'll email it to you. But, I think the moral complexity of what would happen for people who were in fact Stasi agents when the wall came down and their whole world changed was a really fascinating one. Sorry, David, I interrupted, but I just looked up the box because it occurred to me I should mention it here.
No, not at all. And I mean, I think one of the things that I really enjoyed about the book was the dealing. There's a bit at the end, right, Paul, where I think, without giving too much away, because obviously everyone knows that the wall fell, you sort of deal a little bit with that through the eyes of one of the Stasi characters in the book, who's sort of navigating this new world, after there's been this whole geopolitical shift and the world underneath him has fallen out. But I wanted to ask a little bit about writing from the perspective of Anne, because I'm also the book that I'm working on now has a female protagonist, and I was struck, in thinking about The Mercenary, for example, where you really, I think for the most part, dealt with, primary characters that are male, that are men. I'm just kind of curious about what it was like to write from the standpoint of Anne, and kind of, what made you think you could pull it off, or how did it come about that you featured her as the central figure in the book?
Well, so first, once I decided on the conceit that this was a Romeo Network, it sort of almost required me to write it from the point of view of one of the Juliets, which is what Anne Sanderson is. And then I did have to sort of evaluate, my ability to inhabit a character, a woman. And I guess, when I think about great literature, I think of things like Wuthering Heights and the male character of Heathcliff, which was written by a 29-year-old Englishwoman. And I think of Anna Karenina, which is this brilliant novel about a woman who was written by a late middle-aged Russian man. And so I was able to convince myself, not that I was as good as they were, but that if I was able to find the needs, the wants, the desires of a young woman and put her in a context that placed demands on her, I could create a credible character. And I think that's what I started with. What is her motivation? What are the things that she struggles to deal with? And they're saying, if it had been a man, I think they would have been the same. So I didn't really think of her so much as a woman as I did a character. And by creating that hopefully fully realized character, I gave her this sense of genuineness that I was looking to do. So I didn't really start with the idea that this is a woman. I started with the idea that this is a character who finds herself in a particular situation. And it's so my next book, not jumping ahead, but I'm doing what you're doing. I have a non-official cover woman who.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
And it's a fascinating thing, because one of the differences between the CIA that I've written about, starting in 53 and then now 89, is that the CIA itself has changed significantly. It was an old boy network in 53. The case officers and the administrators had gone to Brown or Princeton, Yale. It was a group of young men, idealistic, who decided that they wanted to do right in the world, and the CIA was a good place to do that. But by 89, and certainly by 2001, it had become a bureaucracy. Many more people, and they'd had to bring in many different types of people, and certainly women who were relegated to administrative positions and secretarial positions or human resource positions. By 2000, you had a very senior group of women. And in fact, up until the current director, 5 of the 8 or 9 top directorates were held by women. And that was a pretty remarkable change in the organization, which I think, I'm sure has made it a better organization, but certainly a different organization as well. And so you might, as a former case officer, how did you think about that as an issue in the organization?
Well, I should specify former analyst, not case officer. Okay. Different job. But I was struck. I just hearing you talk about the differences that you sort of conveyed in your novels between the agency of the 50s and the agency of the 80s, and now the 2000s. I was having a conversation a few weeks ago with a former colleague about the bureaucracy of actually the covert action process, the process to get a finding signed by the president to approve a covert action program. And, this is all, none of this is classified. This is all sort of, available in grad school textbooks. But I think it's still pretty darn interesting because, if you look at the agency of the 50s, that you've examined, Paul, I mean, you're right. It's an old boys club. It's a wink and a nod kind of a setup for some of these more, what today would be considered very aggressive covert action programs that were really done, by the president calling the CIA director and, getting or having someone call the CIA director to approve something and get something moving in a way that could be totally deniable. And there weren't lawyers involved really. And there was no congressional oversight, really. The Church Pike hearings in the 70s changed that. And, now if you're trying to get a covert action program done, I mean, the army of lawyers that are required and the amount of paperwork and the extent to which there is congressional oversight of that process is, tremendous. And I think would probably surprise almost anyone who kind of looks at the CIA through the lens of, sort of pulpy spy thrillers, many of which are quite fun and wonderful, but, don't convey what it's really like to do that job or to work there. So, anytime I talk to a former colleague about a covert action program of any kind, the number one comment I get is the extent to which there are congressmen and women and lawyers involved to an extent that I think would surprise almost anybody who kind of looks at it from the outside in. So I think you're right. I mean, and I've written a little bit about this too, that on the bureaucratic side of the house, I mean, the agency is sort of an interesting place because it's a large entity, it's a large bureaucracy. So in many ways, it would behave like Toyota or AT&T or Coca-Cola, any big place that's got a lot of people working there and it's organizationally complex. And, generally what that means is that a lot of people are sending a lot of emails and there's a lot of meetings and, there's a tremendous amount of internal politics over who gets what job and how people ascend the organization. It means there's clunky interfaces with customers. All of that kind of stuff is true. And then on the flip side of it, you also have this very exceptional mission that is very unique from almost any other organization on the planet. And the kinds of stories that, someone who's even been there for a few years will come out with are quite remarkable from that standpoint, because they're doing things that, people who are working at Toyota or at, PepsiCo aren't really doing. So you have to sort of deal with this bipolarity and realize that both of those aspects of the agency are true at the same time, which I think is is sort of a hard thing to hold in your head, that, at once you can have office supply shortages, and on the other side, you can track people down in the mountains of Afghanistan and, make them disappear. That organization, it's the same place that's having both of those issues.
So it's interesting you say all of that, because people have asked me, so, I worked in the music business and the media business for 20 years. And they say, so on what grounds do you think you can write a spy novel? And, the answer is that where I worked, Time Warner, it was a bureaucracy. And
right.
we managed the political environment inside. There were a lot of personalities. You had to get people to agree on initiatives. You need to get backing. And that aspect of the bureaucracy is the same as the CIA. The principal difference is that, Time Warner's mission was to make profits, and the CIA's mission is really to advise the President of the United States on national security issues, urgent matters. So, the people who are case officers or analysts have really tense, very demanding positions, because what's at stake are lives and national security. And that creates, this aura within the organization that probably creates a lot of burnout, but also a sense of mission. Whereas if you're in the music business, what you're worried about is which song is going to be on the top of the charts in a particular week, which is a good thing, but it doesn't have quite the same, gravitas as whether or not there's going to be a strike against the World Trade Center. But anyways, I think both of us in different ways have come to writing. And I think I say about myself that I was a writer before I was a businessman. And then I returned to writing because in some ways it was a calling that I always had in my life. And I took a detour for 20 years because, I was not confident about myself to be able to believe I could make a living as a writer. So, I left the corporate career and started writing. And I suspect that before you were an analyst in the CIA, that there was a bit of you that was a writer, that, the Buddhists like to say, when the student is ready, the teacher appears, which you can sort of change into when the writer is ready, the story appears. And I suspect because of, the power and the authenticity and the quality of the writing in your book on Syria, which was, a place that you were dealing with, I think that there's a story that you hit upon that then you chose to write about. And I think it had made it a very compelling novel. There's a power in the language. And you bring to it characters, a romance that which first of all, as soon as you come across the fact that it's a romance between a case officer and a Syrian asset, you say to yourself, that doesn't happen. You get fired for that.
You do get fired for that. You get fired for that. I made there's a lot of things in the book that are true, but there's a lot of things I made up too, because it was fiction and I had fun making things up. But that's, yeah, that does not happen really.
Well,
You're
that's
absolutely right.
that's the wonderful thing about being a writer. You know, you pick a place, you pick your characters, and then you tell a story. And to be believable, you know, as both our novels are sort of based in realism. We're not, you know, it's not satire. And so I always feel like I have to make the book historically accurate enough so it doesn't make somebody feel uncomfortable that I'm sort of making up bits of history. So the history, which is the context, I think works, but then within it, the story is its own thing. It's sort of an imaginary world that we inhabit with characters who find themselves in an historical moment. And I think that's true of your book, and it's certainly true, you know, of Berlin 1989.
How did you do that in the Matchmaker? Because I was struck that it had this feel. I mean, as someone who wasn't in Berlin in 1989, but who's, you know, read books about it, nonfiction primarily, it had this feeling of, I never got the sense where I was stepping back from the book and saying, oh, hey, you know, BS, Paul made this up. So it felt very real, but I'm sure there were also things in the book where you, for sake of plot or character, kind of said, I'm going to set aside specific realism here or the chronology to kind of get what I want from a storytelling standpoint. I'm just kind of curious, how did you balance that sense of fact or sort of truth and then your own imagination as you were putting it together?
Well, it starts with a lot of research. In my case, I did 6 months of research, and the research was reading biographies of people who were German, who were there at that point in time, and sort of beginning to inhabit Berlin in 1989 in this way that it's almost intuitive. You have to have it so a part of your consciousness that all these little details that you had picked up along the way during the research suddenly appear because they are appropriate at a moment. And
without it, you're not cramming them down our
right. No, in fact, as soon as
Yeah.
you're describing something and it feels like it's a description, it's a travel log, and you lose the character, you lose the audience. But for me, the city is another character. The character of Berlin was really important to get right. And you can feel the cold, you can feel the muddy water that's going through the canal, all those little things. Like in some ways, I imagine, you know, where this Ann Simpson lived. And she was living in an area, Kreuzberg, which at that point in time was inhabited by a lot of Turkish immigrants. So I had to give the neighborhood the same sort of quality that somebody would have had when they were there. The porn shops, all those things that you would, as a tourist, you would see, you would sort of take note of, glance at, but it wouldn't be part of your, you know, direct consciousness. It's just things you absorb. And the only way you can get there is to put your head in that place for a long time and then and let it play out. But I think the books I like best are ones that do allow you to inhabit that world. I mean, one of my favorite books is Le Carré's The Spy Who Came In From the Cold. And when you read that book, you are in Germany, and you are feeling the oppressiveness of the work, the loneliness of the work. And what you realize, and Joe Cannon is the same way. I mean, he's a deft writer. With very few strokes of the pen, he's able to describe, you know, moments that are wonderful. And when I talked to him about this, you know, his view is that if you want to create characters, you just make them say something. Don't describe them. Because with you know, 1 or 2 phrases from the mouths of somebody, you'll understand who they are, much more so than if there's, you know, 4 or 5 sentences of descriptive prose where you're left with, you know, a lot of stuff, but you don't know what to make of it.
that's how we experience. I'm struck that as you're saying that is really how we sort of experience other people too, right? Is not,
Right.
it's a little bit, it's both, but it's a little bit less of, I'm not, describing you and what you're wearing, and it's more of how you're carrying yourself and how you're speaking, and kind of your voice that come through initially, that helped me to frame, and it's like not an assessment, but to sketch some outline of who you are. I'm struck as you're saying that's seems true in fiction as well, which makes sense.
Well, also, if there was a long time where I did a bit of writing of dramatic pieces, theater, and there is nothing but dialogue in theater, and yet
Right.
You read Shakespeare and those characters because they're all speaking. Polonius is a clown, and that comes across, and Ophelia is this sort of fragile person who comes across because of what she says. So I think in some ways, being able to write dramatic theater is a great way of trying to create characters without having to describe them, but to let the characters speak. Because if you're going to give them good speech, speech that in some way identify who they are, it means you need to know what they're going to say and how they're going to say it, and what sort of inflection they're going to have. In the case of Anne Simpson, I made her a translator, and I gave her a knowledge of German. And so at different points in the novel, her knowledge of German, Low German and High German, was an important part of the character because she could speak to other Germans, and she knew how to present herself through her knowledge of German. And then I think of speech in some ways a little bit like wine. Wine, it has terroir, which means it's of a place. You speak of a place. And I think we all carry some of that with us. Wherever we were born, we have some view of the world or some speech habits that identify us. And I think that, to me, is trying to get into who the core person is. And then that person, in my case, and in your case too, we make them spies. We make them spies because that's the world we're in, and they're fun. But they're not, they're people first, and then they're spies. And that, I'm sure that's true of the people you met at the agency. I sometimes think of it as, I could have worked at the CIA. I went to corporate America, but we all went to the same schools. We all had the same sort of ambitions and desires. It's just that, we went in different places, and now, we have stories that we're telling about, the choices we made.
Right. So let's talk a little bit about why you chose Damascus in Syria, because I was really intrigued by this idea, David, because it's not a place. I've been to almost every place that anybody can go, but somehow I missed Damascus in Syria because when I was in Jordan, we actually had a moment when we thought we would go to Syria, but we were headed to Israel, and we said foolishly, and this is in 2010, we'll just go to Syria next time. I mean, without, world events were not so clear. And I can't tell you how I regret that, because, they're wonderful. There's wonderful archaeology, there are wonderful ruins. There was a lot about Syria that I would like to have seen. And it didn't occur to me that it would all vanish in a way that maybe a lot of countries haven't been quite so erased. So what prompted you to do Damascus, which is a fascinating city and a really old city?
Yeah. I mean, for me, it was pretty simple. And it was the fact that I had worked on it for the entirety of my CIA career. I had lived there. I traveled there. I had worked on it as an analyst from Langley, all those things. I knew people who were there, Americans and Syrians. And so when I left and started to tinker around with not even really a book, but just kind of processing the conflict, because I left the agency in 2014. So this is at the point in the conflict where it had sort of spiraled from protests and insurgency into kind of full-blown civil war. And so I was spending time sketching out just kind of my own thoughts about what had happened and doing, character sketches and writing down stories. And it became clear to me that there was no other place that I found that I really loved the process of writing and building character and, trying to put some kind of story together, although the first attempts were quite awful. But there was no other place that I was going to be able to set that book. It meant so much to me, and it really mattered. I think, Paul, as you're talking about getting Berlin right and how almost that it's almost a character in and of itself in the book. I felt that way about Damascus of my book. It doesn't really say a specific year like yours does, but it's more or less 2011 to 2013. So it's the opening salvos of sort of protest and civil opposition to the government that turn into what looks like the beginnings of civil war by the end of the book. And that was a period for me where I had been in Damascus. It's a period where I was working on it every day. And, I wanted to get that right. I mean, I break, I accelerate the chronology in some places, and I take my own creative liberties with certain events, but the feel of Damascus in that period was one that I really wanted to nail. Because it was so important to me.
Who's your principal point of view?
Well, I like to. I mean, I like to say the book starts as the CIA case officer. His name's Sam. I wrote, I think, initially thinking that would be a natural point of view, because although I wasn't a case officer, I spent a lot of time with them in the wild and obviously worked at the CIA, and so it felt kind of natural. But I think, and this would probably be open for everyone's own interpretation, but I think as the book progresses, the story really becomes Miriam's, who's his agent and eventual, sort of love interest. They fall into this forbidden relationship. So I think as the book develops, it becomes her story, in part because her situation is more complicated and precarious than his. She's putting everything on the line to work with the CIA, to be with him, and to, in her own way, work for a better future for the country. And I'm not saying the decisions she makes are right by any means, but these are the decisions the character makes. And I think those are much more complicated than the work of a CIA officer whose job it is to recruit spies. She's in a much more interesting and dangerous position. And I think as the book went on and as I kind of wrote more and more from the standpoint of her character, I think the story becomes hers.
And it becomes a very complicated story of loyalties and betrayal. So I would ask both of you, is it possible to write a spy story without really examining loyalty and betrayal? Because, always sort of tick-tocking in the back of any spy story is, how trustworthy is anybody? I mean, Le Carre was a real master at that, right? But I think it's always, you always are questioning people.
Let me take a shot at this.
Yeah, please.
A soldier's job is to fight and to kill. Very simple. You go out, and that's your job is. A spy's job is to lie, to suborn, and to get what you need to get in order to have the intelligence that you can, deliver to the White House. And I didn't say that. I'm sort of, there's a William Hood, who was a pretty high-ranking case officer in the 50s and the early 60s, wrote a book called The Mole. And it's about his work in the agency. And if you haven't read it, David, you should read it. It's a really wonderful book. But he's the one who said that. And so in some ways, you're reducing the work of the case officer to what it is, which is you need to get intelligence that you need to supply to the people who are making recommendations to the President of the United States. It pretty much is anything goes if you need to get the right intelligence. And in some ways, I think that's what makes the spy novel interesting, because you're sort of pushing the limits of civilized behavior. For the
okay, but in your book, Paul, you've got questions about loyalty in a marriage, loyalty to a family, loyalty to children, all kinds of strength, not just gathering intelligence and all, but there are levels of loyalty and levels of betrayal in a very wide sense that, make the book powerful.
Well, right. And I think, as I said, spies are people, and they come to their jobs with children, with wives. And that, I think, that is the conflict for many people. There's great stress placed on families.
Well, I do too, but I mean, basically what you've got is an unreliable narrator, in real life is what you really do, a spy by nature in real life is going to be an unreliable narrator. And I think that's what makes the genre so interesting to a lot of people, are these really complicated questions about, where true loyalty lies to yourself, to your family, your friends, people you love, your government, whatever. And, David, I think that in your character, the Syrian characters have some huge questions like that to deal with, much more so than your American guy. I mean, he's a lot more straightforward, but, the other characters, especially the Syrians, really have some very complex things to be dealing with.
Yeah. Well, I think, one of the my favorite reviews I've gotten of Damascus Station was by a guy named John Wilson, who was writing at First Things, and the title of the review was "We Are All Double Agents," which I think is spot on. And I think that what's fun about spy novels, and what's I think fun about both of our books, is that it sort of provides, in the landscape of a book that could be quite sort of high concept and have exciting, dramatic things happen in a really sexy geopolitical context. You're sort of dealing with maybe some of the mundane business of being a human, and having, like we all do in our own sort of lives, marriages, jobs, whatever, this tension of double loyalty, or betrayal, or dealing with the reality around people. People are, can be good people and do bad things, and there can be bad people that do good things, and it's complicated. And so I think what's fun about these books is that you can kind of deal with some tension between moral clarity and moral ambiguity in a way that's propulsive in a narrative context, and feel like the stakes are high. And I think that while still being true to that reality of kind of human experience, that there are things that are good and there are things that are bad, and there's a whole lot of gray in between, and it's navigating some of that grayness that we find most of our human experience in. And I think that's what's fun about that's what I think was fun about the Anne Simpson character, Paul, in your book, right? I mean, that she's doing things in the book that seem good, and she's doing things in the book that seem bad, and she's not, I agree with you, Barbara, that she's not always quote unquote a likable character, but I think that's what kind of made me keep turning the pages, was that she was interesting. I was interested in what was going to happen and how she was going to maneuver through the situation, even if there were times where I thought, I'm not sure I'd want to be the one in the Kempinski bar having a drink with her, but I'm interested to see what she does next. And I think that that was the fun part about this read.
To be realistic, it's the inherent ambiguity in some of the characters and their actions that make these books thrillers. Yeah. If we knew for sure, if they were really clear cut, they wouldn't be thrillers. So there has to be, the reader has to be going on a journey with you, trying to work out exactly where all these loyalties and so forth lie and where they're going. It would be really boring if you didn't throw in all of that.
So I think one of the things about both our books is that, which distinguish them in the sort of scheme of spy novels, which there are, there's a whole range, but and some are, more character driven, and some are more sort of thriller driven. I think ours are more character driven. But the distinction I make is, books that are sort of dealing with the ordering of facts and books that are dealing with the movements of the mind. And I think in our case, our characters themselves are struggling with situations that they're a part of. And it's their choices and their decisions in sort of, difficult situations that make them interesting and make them unpredictable and surprise us. And that I think is one of the things that a novel has to do in order to sustain the interest of the reader.
Well, I think there's clue that some spy stories are more character driven and some are more action driven.
Right.
But that's true of all manner of books. But, I think both of you wrote wonderful and very interesting looks at cities and characters that are really fascinating. Patrick, do you want to come join us and see if we have any questions from the audience or questions of your own? Patrick's a very thoughtful reader and questioner all by himself there.
Well, thanks. Let's see here. I do have a question. Let's see. Michael would like to ask Paul. He says, on the topic of background, knowing your family history with the CIA, knowing your family history with the CIA underworld was a touch point for your writing career. How did this personal perspective inform your most recent work?
Isn't that David?
Well, I think the question relates to, I had an uncle by the name of Frank Olson, which was the subject of my third book. And he worked at Fort Detrick. He was a bioweapons chemist who happened to be given LSD and fell or jumped from the 13th floor of the Statler Hotel in 1953. All of that was kept from the family until 1975 during the Pike hearings, in which the Rockefeller Commission report revealed that this man, anonymous in the report, had been given LSD the week before, was taken to New York, and then fell or jumped from the hotel window. And the family said, that's Frank Olson and my uncle. And of course, that became a very powerful story for me, one that I tried to write a couple of times and couldn't, and then finally found a way to put distance between myself and the story. But I did find this character who we believe he worked in the CIA. He had transferred over. He did top secret work that he couldn't talk to his wife about. And he had qualms about the work, and he couldn't talk to his colleagues about his qualms, unless he was to, appear disloyal. So he was lonely. He was trapped in himself with these deep, deep conflicts and concerns about his work. And then he basically, my view is he was murdered. And so I sort of took that character and found a way to follow that character into other characters in my novels, characters who are in this lonely business, case officers, not analysts, and who have to make difficult choices. And it's almost always a moral choice about what you think might be right versus what your job may require you to do. And I think that moral quandary, that choice, is really what most spy novels we find attractive in most spy novels. It's not clear cut. You're sort of put out there on a limb. You're doing things that are difficult, which may be extrajudicial. But if you're doing them in Syria or if you're doing it in Berlin, that doesn't matter because you're sort of working on behalf of national security, whatever that means. And I think that's the sort of thing that I find interesting. And in fact, in this book, I make a reference to those choices. I'm not giving anything away, but when the wall falls, this Stasi agent, is now outside. He's sort of into the cold, and he's being recruited by the Soviets, by the KGB, and by the CIA because he knew things people wanted. So even though he was a pretty terrible man, the CIA and the KGB were both sort of, it was, like the NFL. Come on over here. We'll set you up in Santa Barbara. The fact that he had killed people was sort of overlooked. We need his intelligence.
Can you maybe both speak a little bit to what kind of psychological screening or profiling occurs in the intelligence business? I'm sure there are plenty of people that are, brilliant men and women who are qualified in every other way, but there's some part of their psychological makeup that renders them not right for that kind of work. Is that true?
Yeah, it is true. I mean, it's sort of the level and intensity and type of screening is going to depend very much on the type of job. If you're talking about sort of getting in, that's going to be a very different answer depending on whether you're going to become a support officer, an analyst, a case officer, someone who's doing more of the paramilitary work. It's all sort of going to be different depending on the type of role you're doing. We also do extensive screening of agents to determine, are they who they say they are? Are they psychologically stable, to the extent that someone who's committing treason can be, and things of that nature. So I mean, the way that case officer colleagues will describe sort of that role is like a psychology, 501 or 601 class of trying to get to the bottom of, to the deep things that motivate people and how they can be encouraged and sort of manipulated or persuaded to do things that might seem on the face of it to be very much against their interests. So I think, it's the whole sort of enterprise has been painted very much by Hollywood as this kind of, running around with a gun, usually in the United States. Maybe, the intelligence officer who's the protagonist is bipolar, and you're sort of in this kind of shoot 'em up world. And I think it's very much not that. It's much more about what motivates people and how do you get, how do you get the information that you need from someone who has it or can access it? And that's a psychological question, and that's one that is sort of at the center of the business. So the screening to sort of get in to do that work, and then of the people who are doing it is as you can imagine quite intense in both sort of the formal tests that you might take all the way to just hands-on experiential kind of field work that help to prove whether or not people can really do it.
Any other questions, Patrick?
Let's see here. Okay, Pat wants to know, she says, how trapped are they, presumably intelligence agents? Can they ever really retire?
I'll you retired.
Well, so I mean, I'll give my PSA for the verbiage here. An intelligent agent is never the American in this case. From a CIA standpoint, I was not a CIA agent. The American characters in Paul's book are not CIA agents; they're CIA officers. The agent is usually the foreigner who is stealing information for the CIA and providing it. And so, I think that's almost always in sort of Hollywood iterations. There's an agent who's the person who's carrying a gun around and works for the CIA, and that's not the case. I will answer though, for officers, it's very easy to get out. You resign. I resigned. I was given a stack of paperwork in a room, and I signed a bunch of things that say I have to send them, manuscripts of my books and my resume and articles I write until the day I die. And, but I'm out and I don't have access to the information. I don't work for the CIA anymore. Agents who are foreigners who are working for the agency can retire too and just stop reporting. They might move to a position in their government where they no longer have access to that information, or they might decide for the sake of, sort of their own sanity or their family's, health or security that they can't do it anymore. And, those are not easy conversations, but they're ones where obviously the CIA would prefer that people keep reporting information, but there's an understanding that sometimes people can't, and that their actual ability to provide useful information could be compromised if they continue. And so they just stop. And that is very much a reality of the work, and it's something that happens quite frequently.
Fascinating stuff.
It is, but there've been a couple of really good books written about what happens if a CIA agent becomes, if dementia or some other unfortunate disease overcome, they're no longer reliable because of aging or whatever it might happen to be. Do you remember that absolutely wonderful book that I'm going totally blank once again on his name, but it was a kid a young man who thought his father was a washing machine salesman, and it turned out his father was actually an agent, but now he has dementia to the point where he's unreliable, and so his former colleagues want to kill him because they're afraid he's going to relieve a lot of secrets. It was a wonderful concept for a book.
Gosh, I can't remember.
I know I've read, I'm ashamed to say I've read the book, but I can't remember the name of it.
Well, it was the paperback, I think, original, but it was a fabulous book, but it raised a really good point. If you have a field agent who, for some medical reason, becomes unreliable, and if he then poses a danger to everybody else because, he may leak things, what happens? I mean, I thought it was a great question.
I saw the documentary about your uncle, Paul. Was it the same story?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
Were
you involved?
Wormwood was the documentary.
Right.
Yeah. Were you consulted about that at all?
I had written something that was sort of book length, and I sent it to them, which was sort of my take on basically the family. In our case, it was what happened to the family after Frank Olson died. And it was, from a family point of view, a tragedy. I mean, his death was a tragedy, but what happened to the family was tragic. And what it's a very complicated thing, because when you're working in the CIA at the very top levels, you're having to make difficult choices, and sometimes the choices require the sacrifice of, I'll say not so much the murder of, but the emotional sacrifice of personal relationships. And in his case, my aunt was never told what happened. She became alcoholic. The older son, Eric, has spent his life, for the most part, trying to answer the question, why did my father die, and how? And those burdens placed on families of men and women who work in the agency are considerable and often not understood as well as they should be. And I think that's one of the things that I try and write about in my novels, is to show the personal side of the sacrifice that men and women have to make doing this very urgent and important work, but work that also can carry great burdens with it.
Have you seen the documentary made by William Colby's son?
Absolutely. He's an example of the burden that he carried, and Colby, who I admire greatly, is one of these, Princeton graduates who wanted to get into the business because he thought that, America had a role to play after the war. And he, worked at the National Labor Relations Board. He wasn't Republican or Democrat. He was a guy just with a mission. And then, he ended up doing things like running the Phoenix program, which I think everyone would agree was a disaster. Thousands of people died as a result of that. And he, as a Catholic, carried the burden of what he did. And he couldn't talk to his family, and he certainly couldn't talk to his son about it. And then he dies mysteriously. He leaves the CIA, and his body is found, I guess, a couple of years after he's left the CIA. Nobody knew whether he committed suicide, drowned accidentally, or was murdered. And it's still a mystery. And it certainly has left his son with this, difficult legacy to deal with.
Oh. Anything else, Patrick?
No, I think that's about it. Quick question though for both of you. The obligatory question about movies and TV. Have you sold the rights to your books and any news there?
Go ahead.
Go first, Paul.
Well, so I have a film co-agent, but we haven't sold the rights to any of the books, and I'm hopeful something will happen. But the TV world and the film world right now are a very odd place. They've been disrupted, more so than everything other than the music business, I think.
Well, David, if your first book sold?
No, so we're in conversations with a few production companies about it, and I'm hopeful that we'll have some good news. But it is not sold yet. And I'll echo Paul's comment about getting things, optioned or made right now. I think there's a great. I don't know if it's apocryphal, but I think it's been attributed to Hemingway, where someone had asked him at some point about getting his stuff made in movies, and his advice was, if you want to get your book made into a movie, avoid the process. Just go dump your manuscript over the California border and wait till they send you a check or something like that, because you might as well not even try to get into the middle of it. It's been a very interesting sort of process to understand how it works, and it's given me a remarkable amount of both sort of respect and admiration for the luck of people who get things made, because it's quite the process to go through.
Well, streaming television is a golden age for authors getting books made into, a visual form. So we'll see. The longer the pandemic goes on and the more streaming television there is, we'll see how it goes. So let me thank everybody for joining us this evening. Paul Vidich, the missionary. No, sorry, the Matchmaker. I don't know why I have missionary in my mind. The Matchmaker, of which we have autographed copies at the store, which is really a wonderful book. And then David McCloskey, Damascus Station, in which we will have autographed copies at the store when David comes to visit us a bit later. He's been done in by weather in Dallas, he tells me, and so it may be a delay here getting to Phoenix, where I have to say we've had a remarkably nice winter where everybody else has put up with a truly dreadful one. So it's been a good year. We'll pay for it in July.
Yep.
But right. Anyway, guys, it's been a real pleasure to have you and to talk to you. Thank you for spending time with us. Good night, everybody. Thank you so much.
Good night.
Bye.
Thank you. Good night.
Hello. We hope you're enjoying our programs and podcasts with authors. We'd like to expand them, and your help would be appreciated. Please make a donation at poisonedpenfoundation.org. 100% of the proceeds will go to help connect authors with readers in this difficult time. Thank you.